DJGSD. As was mentioned, I've been a visiting professor with the university now since 2019. So we've delivered a number of these lectures on different topics over the last 4 years, and just in that 4-year period, there's been an enormous amount of change in both the energy sector and in this case in the development of environmental finance. So I'm going to endeavour to present from my screen. I note today that we're going to be talking about things that are actually rapidly developing, and as such, I invite people to raise questions and thoughts as we go. I've got up at the moment a web browser pointing at the homepage for the TNFD, and I'd invite those that have got web access to, by all means, pull that up and just take a browse around on it whilst I'm presenting. But let's get into the presentation per se. So yes, as mentioned, today's lecture is an introduction, and it is very much only an introduction to the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure. This is in the context, as Kunsunarat mentioned, of a series of lectures that we did. So this is today's lecture marked, this lecture. Another one coming up next week, which will be looking at case studies from biodiversity and other environmental markets. But perhaps to introduce myself for a start, why am I someone who has been invited to speak about this? So perhaps the most relevant things in my background, I was an academic, a full-time academic for many years. I was one of the founding directors of the University of New South Wales Centre for Energy and Environmental Markets, and we did a lot of research about the strengths and weaknesses of using markets for electricity, for renewable energy, for carbon, and increasingly for other public goods. And I think one of the things that has come out of that research, if I were to compress sort of 15 years of research down into one sentence, it is that it is much harder to make these sorts of markets and such work than it is to design them. They have all tended in one way or another to operate differently to what was expected. So I left academia. I was invited to join the then brand new Macquarie Bank climate change team, and I spent the best part of a decade with Macquarie, where I led a whole series of transactions around a wide range of climate-related assets. So we bought and invested into all sorts of businesses. And again, one of the things that came out of that was the difficulty on some of those businesses of actually measuring the issues of risk that we were taking on, and that's very much what today's lecture is going to be about. But to come to my current role, so as mentioned, I've been a visiting professor with the centre now since 2019. My main business is Aton Consulting, and I've got there the link to who we are. But we're a small boutique consulting firm that specialises in energy policy, environmental policy, due diligence, cost benefit analysis, this sort of work. And among other things, we've been working with the New South Wales Department of Environment and with the Australian Grains Research and Development Corporation, looking at a whole range of environmental finance things. Separately, I'm also a co-founder of a small fund that does investments, particularly around the biodiversity and carbon investment space. So I'd like to hope that I bring something of a mix of the academic background with the experience of actually had money in the game. One of the little career indiscretions that I like to sometimes mention to people, I'm actually one of the first people in Australia to have lost a fair bit of their own money trying to set up a carbon fund. I was involved in the carbon fund back in the early 90s. And it was an educational exercise as to why that failed, and it also all had to do with risk and the measurement of risk. So again, it comes very much to today's lecture. So with all that said as introduction, what is the TNFD? Well, in my opinion, it's one of the most significant developments in the last decade. There's the short answer, right? If you have not heard of it, you are probably going to. It's quite, I think, going to have quite a high level of impact, both across the corporate sector and in the finance sector. So it is a matter that is well worth you spending some time to become familiar with. And today's lecture is very much only an introduction to it. So I should say from the outset that I have no formal involvement with the TNFD consortium. I'm not a contracted consultant with them. I'm not involved in their management groups. I am purely an external consultant who is watching this from the outside. That said, we are being asked by clients to consider how the TNFD is going to be applied in their businesses, and it is clearly the way of the future. So what's it about? Let me give a concrete example, a rather extreme example, but nonetheless a true one. If a fund is investing into a new copper mine or gold mine, how should they assess the environmental risks and opportunities that they're being presented with? So that's both in terms of making the initial investment decision, do I want to invest into this particular mine versus any other mine, but also how they manage the asset and what they report to the investors. So let's take a look for a moment at the extremely fraught history of the Ok Tedi mine in Papua New Guinea. This is probably, to my mind, the most extreme example of environmental risks at play. And we should ask ourselves, how might we have preemptively, before we got into it, how might we have avoided those risks? If we had been the investment manager, how would this have rolled out? So a little bit of history for a moment here on the Ok Tedi mine. This was a mine on the border between Papua New Guinea and Indonesia, as it then was, which was set up by BHP, it's a large multinational mining company. They first mined gold there in 1991, and a common method of extracting gold is to pump a slurry which contains cyanide, which happens to be one of the few things that dissolves gold, into the ground, and then you pump the slurry back up and you process it. Now, this form of mining obviously presents significant risk that if the slurry is not contained, it will contaminate things. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. Circa 80 million tonnes of contaminated tailings were spilling into the local rivers every year. It caused what was later called widespread ecological damage. The local inhabitants obviously were not very happy about this, and it actually turned into an armed insurgency. So we're talking people walking around with rifles, shooting at the incoming aircraft and equipment. Ultimately, BHP decided to sell out of the mine under fairly difficult circumstances. They transferred it to the Papua New Guinea government, and they were then subject to a long set of legal claims, which led to in the order of $4 billion in compensation being claimed. It was eventually settled for much less than that. I've quoted a number there of 110 million. Nonetheless, it spent years and years and years in court. It certainly caused international relations to be difficult between PNG and Australia. It was a financial disaster for BHP, and of course it was a disaster for the inhabitants that lived in the area. So when we're going through this stuff on the TNFD, have in mind this case. Imagine that you were being presented as an investment manager in a bank to invest into a new mine And this is what you want to avoid. There's a concrete case study that you can take. It's a very extreme case study. Obviously, most things are nowhere near as extreme as this, but it's not a bad one to have in mind, to my view. So what actually is the TNFD? It's a framework. It's not a standard setting organisation. It's a framework for how to report on risks and impacts that relate to nature in the businesses that you're either operating or that you're investing into. So the core task force members, let's drop out of the slide deck for a moment and let's go and actually have a look at the website. I've listed here in the presentation some of the core ones, but I'm just going to stop my presentation. Where's the button for that? So you should be able to see the front page of the TNFD website on my screen now. Let's take a look for a second about who they are. So you can see on the task force that is driving it, we've got quite a collection here of people from very large financial services companies, BlackRock, AXA, Macquarie, HSBC, and many others. We also have quite a considerable consortium of major corporate entities. So the group that is providing the leadership on it is from quite a wide range of both financial services and different sorts of major corporates. And then we've got on there some of the service providers to it, but you'll note in particular that all four of the major consulting groups are there, as is S&P, and at least one of the exchanges. So we've got quite a diverse range of organisations that are sitting behind it. The funding for it is coming from, you see it's down the bottom, but let's actually had a full list of the funding. So it's funded by a mix of government funding. So they've mentioned their funding directly from the Department of Climate Change here in Australia, the French government, the German government, the Norwegian, Netherlands government, as well as the Global Environment Facility. The GEF is an arm of the World Bank, is funding it, and the UN Development Program, as well as the MacDoc Foundation. MacDoc Foundation is a philanthropic organisation that is based out of Australia. But again, you can see quite a global reach, and you'll note when we get into talking about the pilot studies and the work that's done there is that it also has quite strong linkages with the United Nations Environment Program. So between the mix of a global consortium of major finance companies and major lenders who are committing to seek to use this framework in their internal decision-making, and a large number of very significant corporates, I think we are talking an initiative that has got substantial momentum behind it. The timeline on this, they actually started work initially back in about 2019 from memory. So it has been being developed for some little while. They are currently in a beta version testing of this. So they released a beta version 0.4 some months ago and sought to do some pilot studies and some testing on it. The target is to release the first production version of this in September of this year. So it's only now a couple of months away. The key thing that I come back to is on this, and an important matter, the TNFD is not itself a standard setting organisation. What it is a framework that then relies upon various tools and standards that sit underneath it. Now, a particular development that has occurred just very recently, like in the last few weeks, and we discussed this somewhat in some of the earlier lectures, is that we've seen significant developments just recently in terms of international accounting and reporting standards. And again, something that is well worth being aware of is that the accounting standards boards have actually just released requirements, so standard setting around disclosures of sustainability related financial information and climate related disclosures. So I've got the URL for that showing on the screen. In terms of standard settings, this is where the standard is set, and then the question is, well, how do you meet that standard? And you meet it from your accounting systems and from applying the TNFD framework. So again, another reason for assuming that this probably is going to get traction as a substantial framework is that it's going to be the thing that people ask for when they say, well, have you done your disclosures to the accounting standard? And you say, yes. The question then is, well, how do you know that? And the answer will be, well, because we've applied the TNFD framework. So my view is it's going to become the de facto standard for doing this, and hence again is well worth being aware of. So what did the TNFD team say about themselves? Global, market-led, deliver a risk management and disclosure framework. So what do they mean by framework? It simply means here's a set of steps that we go through. They're not mandating any particular tool set or any particular way that you have to go through those steps, but it's attempting to set an overarching framework to bring some consistency to how one identifies, measures, and quantifies the materiality of nature-related risks and opportunities. They have deliberately attempted to make it flexible and such that it can be applied both for the corporate sector and across financial institutions of different size. Now, that really means that the framework is designed to be flexible. So again, I come back to the point, they're not standard setting. They are saying, here's a framework and you apply it to your organisation as you believe it fits your organisation, albeit that they give some guidance as to what that might mean. The other point to note here is that the TNFD is a sister, if you like, to a previously released task force, which was the Task Force for Carbon Disclosure. So this has been gone through previously. And the thing that I would point out there is that the TNCD, following its release, has achieved quite a high level of acceptance by companies in terms of being the reporting framework for their carbon emissions and carbon disclosures. And again, I'd suggest that this is probably similar to what we will see with the TNFD. If anything, I think the TNFD will probably have a faster take-up because it's obviously building on the back of existing systems that are now reasonably well accepted. The TNFD process itself has gone through a series of piloting, and I have highlighted there both a report that has been released from the United Nations Environment Programme discussing the outcomes of the pilot programs that they did. And there's also a substantial list of other pilots here. Now, let's see if we can just, again, pull that up. So back on the website, so they've got quite a deal of material sitting on there about the pilots. Let's take a look at the actual framework as they have released it. So they've mentioned here that the fourth or the final version of the beta framework has been released. And if we look at the executive summary about that, this document here, you can see that they are discussing it being all based around what they refer to as the LEAP approach, L-E-A-P. So the core idea there, to bring up the slide on it, is to go through a process. So again, the framework is all about having a process that fits the organisation that you're in. So having a process that locates where the interface between your business or the financial services business that you're working in or that you're looking to invest into, where are its connections into the natural environment. So let's take, for example, here, coming back to our Ok mine example. When we step through this process, we would obviously fairly quickly identify that there is a significant interface between mining using cyanide-based solvents and the local water environment and the local streams. So you would quickly, as part of the locate part of this, identify that there is an interface there to those local ecosystems. You would identify that there are indigenous groups that live around that mine that rely on those watercourses. You would identify that there's a series of other biodiversity and environmental impacts that come from that. So in the case of that Ok mine, you would come away from that locate stage thinking, yes, this business has actually got very significant connections to the environment, and you would then move on to the evaluate stage, which is where to work through in some level of detail what the nature of those dependencies and potential impacts are. The assessment phase, for those of us that have been working in risk management in some capacity, you'd be familiar with the idea of creating a risk matrix and attempting to quantify the risk of something happening to the potential impacts that flow from that, and to then ask, well, what are the risk mitigations that we could put in place? So again, that's precisely what's been picked up and used in this assess phase. It's to say, to go through all of those interfaces that you've identified and say, well, what actually is the risk that we face here? And the risk in that case of our Ok mine, the risk there was, well, we're going to accidentally spill or leach this cyanide solvent into the local watercourse. What are the risk mitigations that you can take to that? So obviously there'd be a series of things, the most obvious one being to use some other form of mining, but there would be other risk mitigants that you could imagine could be applied. And then, having gone through and assessed the risks and the mitigants and how material they are, would then be to prepare. So that is to say, to work out from a management perspective what actions you could actually take, to create a strategy for doing that, to create metrics to measure the success of your strategy, to manage those risks, and to then do the disclosure and reporting that goes with that. So again, you could imagine that the report for, let's say, a promoter, someone who was coming to a bank for financing for that BHP Ok mine or a similar kind of mine, they would come forward to the bank and they would say, well, look, we've identified as part of this that we are dependent upon these watercourses. We're going to be using a cyanide solvent. That presents a material risk. How big a material risk is it? Well, you'd be using some of the tools that we'll discuss in a moment to attempt to quantify the nature of that risk and the sort of financial and natural environment impacts that it might have. You would then say, for those risks, the following management strategies are going to be applied. So it might say something like, we will be doing monthly management audits of the level of discharge from our tailings, and we'll be reviewing these things at the board meeting on a monthly basis, or whatever the strategies are that one comes up with to deal with those risks. But you would go to the bank saying, well, there are the strategies that we're applying. Here's how we're measuring that, and you'd attempt to get reasonably qualitative. You'd say, look, we're going to be measuring and then publicly reporting about the number of discharges that occur every week. And then you come forward and say, here's how we're proposing to be reporting these things. And hopefully with that level of information, the banks would be able to look at it and say, yes, you've got those risks somewhat managed, and we're prepared to invest into you. Or conversely, to say, no, this looks like a disaster that is going to happen to someone, and we're not wishing to invest into that. So I think, again, if you have in your mind how this would have been applied to that BHP Octedi mine fairly clearly, the original lenders into that if they had been presented with this sort of analysis, would quite likely have sat back and said, no, look, we don't want that mine to proceed in the way that it is proceeding, and we prefer you to put in place certain other mitigants. So it's all about trying to identify the nature of the risks that you're taking on, and what sort of actions you could take to manage them, and what sort of financial and other impacts it might have. Now, at that point, as I said, we're going to get into a bit of detail and look at some of the tools and things, but I might just stop there for a moment and ask, because I can't see I think, any hands that are up. Are there any questions or comments at this point? Gun, can you see it?
Yes. It's Pandit here.
Pandit.
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning. There are some several climate-related financial disclosures task force out there. One of them is Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD. I know the nature-related TNFD has different purpose, but can you draw some comparisons as to the similarities or dissimilarities on, as to say, for the process, the reporting, the risk management issues?
Sure. Okay, so again, to come back to the question of risk management. Risk management, of course, is not a new thing. This has been something that all banks and corporates have been doing for quite some time. Both the TNCD and the TNFD have essentially taken that risk management approach, the risk matrix approach, where you're attempting to identify and quantify and then work out mitigants. They're both based on that same risk management strategy, and that's not novel. It's been a standard approach for many years, and for good reason. It is quite a solid approach to risk management. The core difference that I would identify between these is that the climate-related disclosures, there's two sorts of disclosure that come out there. One is around the direct emissions, and so the scope 1, 2, 3 emissions that the organisation is responsible for, and that, of course, is a whole new area of reporting. If we just go back 10 years, it was extremely uncommon for any organisation to be reporting its scope 1, 2, 3 carbon emissions, and it is now pretty well commonplace for any significant sized organisation to be reporting those things. But even for that, a great deal of work had to be done on how to actually measure and quantify those things. And again, any of us that have actually been involved in attempting to quantify what the actual emissions of a company are, it's actually much harder than you might immediately think. Relatively easy to take a measure like energy consumption and using local emission intensity figures to try and work out what the emissions are, but much harder when you start getting to questions around the use of transport or embedded energy that are sitting inside buildings that they're building, or all of these other things. It throws up a whole series of quantification problems. Now, those have been worked through to a greater or lesser extent, but in comparison to what we're dealing with here, that was a simple problem. Measuring carbon is much simpler, despite its huge complexity. It is much simpler than measuring nature-related issues, because this is a much broader category of things. So again, if you take that octeddy example, the number of different ways that you might conceivably impact the environment in a major mining operation is obviously quite extensive. There's lots of different things that could conceivably happen, and not all of them are obviously quantifiable. In the case of carbon emissions, at least in principle, we knew what the metric for measurement was. We knew we were trying to bring it back to 1 tonne of carbon dioxide equivalent emitted somewhere. That's very different here, where you're saying, well, we're trying to measure a biodiversity impact loss, or an impact upon Indigenous people who, the lifestyles of Indigenous people who are living around the area, who lose the ability to eat the fish in their local river. These things are much harder to quantify, and that's I think a large part of what has been coming out of the pilot studies, and we're going to get onto the pilot studies in a moment, but a lot of it has been around the availability of data and the availability of tools. So yes, look, in terms of, to bring that long answer back to a short answer, they are adopting the TNCD and the TNFD are bringing the same philosophic approach to risk management and reporting. The climate-related disclosures have the advantage that they are conceptually simpler than what we're doing here, and hence the availability of data is much better on the climate-related impact side than it is here on this broader question of nature. And as I said, as we work through some of the other slides we've got here, I think that will become even more evident. Sorry, Kunbundit, a long answer to a short question.
Thank you very, very much.
Okay, any other questions from the audience at this point?
Hi, I'm Wanvipa here. So just to add to Kunbundit's questions about different schemes, also just out of curiosity, so TNFD also do the assessment, or they just provide the framework?
No, so TNFD is just a framework, and what they show on their site, and in fact, let's take a look at that. That's a very good moment to look into it. It's quite a complicated framework, or complicated, not the right. It is quite a comprehensive framework, but they have down here a framework toolkit. Sorry, that's actually not showing on my screen. Tool catalog. So what they've actually attempted to do is to say, look, let's take business footprinting. Show me everything. And they've attempted to identify lots of different platforms that other people have made that would allow you to go through the process of, in this case, doing a footprinting exercise. Now, they're not saying that these tools are necessarily approved in a formal sense. What they're saying is these are tools that we think somehow relate to this, but you need to make your own decisions as to which tools, which consultants, what sort of data sets you're using. They're really giving a guidance and a framework. They're certainly not seeking to undertake or to mandate the specific approach that's occurring. That said, the and this is why I made the point about the development of the accounting standards that go with it. Right? You can imagine that accounting standards do tend to be much more prescriptive. Now, at this moment, the accounting standards reference in quite broad terms the sort of data that you should be sort of taking into account. So they're saying, well, if you're using the TNFD framework and you're reporting to that, then that is probably an adequate response to the requirements of the accounting standards. I think we would have to assume over time that there will be an increasing consensus and then probably ultimately mandate around the nature of the tools that get used for doing the various different steps through the frameworks. But at this time, that hasn't happened. At this time, it is just a framework with suggested tools that may be useful for undertaking various steps in there. Let's take a look just for a moment on that in terms of the dependencies one. Okay, so a couple of these tools, in particular Seed and Encore. Encore is a very commonly used tool, and you see it mentioned in just about every one of the pilot projects that's used. It is a tool which, from memory, actually had its genesis out of a World Bank funded project, if I remember rightly. I don't quote me on that, but these tools are becoming quite comprehensive and are evolving over time. So to come back to your question, it's purely a framework. They're not doing the work. They're simply saying, here's a framework that you can choose to apply, in the expectation that it's quite likely, if you're a major corporate, it's quite likely the next time that you go for financing to your bank, that the bank's going to say, well, could we please see your TNFD-based disclosure documents, please? Sorry, does that answer that question?
Yes, thank you.
All right, I can't see the hand up. So one last call out. Any questions? Otherwise, we'll move forward. Any last call on questions?
I think this is Sunirat. I think this, from what you said, the TNFD is done before the project to get funding, right? And you also talk about the difficulties to have the data availability.
Yes, so we're certainly going to be talking about data in just a moment. I've got some slides about that. But the TNFD is intended to be a reporting framework on an ongoing and recurrent basis. So I might give the example that you are a mine, that you're a project developer of a mine and you're looking for funding to get that mine built. However, having received that funding, you are going to be, you'll be pretty sure that the lenders, the people who have lent the money to the mine, are going to be asking to see every 6 months or every year your updated set of disclosures. So it becomes part of, and this is why we make the linkage to the accounting standards. The accounting standards globally are moving to incorporate mandated reporting on balance sheets of these sorts of risks. And accounts, of course, generally they're required at least annually, and for larger organisations, they're often required quarterly. And of course, if you are a listed company, you are required to make disclosures whenever there is something that is material that has occurred. And I think you'll find that this is the same, right? Partly because it's becoming increasingly mandated under the accounting standards, but partly also because of general investor and public interest. People are going to be saying, well, have you got up-to-date disclosure documents available on your website? So I'd expect this to be being done, annually. Obviously, having gone through the process the first time where you've established all your frameworks, it's not the full exercise. It's an updating exercise, which is going to be easier. but it's going to happen a lot. And as I said, I come back to my opening comment here, right? From what I have seen and from the comments that people in the finance sector have made, I think this is going to become very, very common. I think it's going to become the de facto standard.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we've mentioned the standards boards are out there. We've mentioned that they're doing it, the uptake, the programs. Okay, they provide in one of their documents this, I think, useful little flow chart around how the reporting goes. Now, again, this looks like quite a busy and complicated diagram. It's actually not. Again, those that have worked in risk management in either a corporate or a financial services group would be familiar with some of the concepts here. Over on the right, at the far right, we've got there the standard list of risks that are generally considered in financial services organisations. So it's a very common thing in a financial services organisation to be doing ongoing assessments about market risk. So that's the risk that you've bought an asset and the price of that asset has changed. Credit risk, that's the risk that you've lent money to someone and they're now no longer able to pay it back. Liquidity risk, so that's the risk that you've got an asset, but you need to sell it in a hurry and you can't because it turns out that there's no immediate market for it. And operational risk, so that's the risk that something actually goes wrong with the business that you're doing. You are attempting to mine for gold, and some piece of machinery blows up, and then you're no longer able to mine for the gold. So that's operational risk. So these are the standard reporting or risk management buckets that would be very familiar to anyone who's worked in risk management in financial reporting. The point that they're making is that all of those risks are, if we move back to the left-hand side of this diagram, all of those risks are in fact impacted by nature-related things. So they've given some examples in there of, say, the company dependencies. So you've got, in the case of our Ok mine, you've got a dependency there that sits around the use of clean water in your mining operations and the use of that slurry, and that presents a set of risks. And then they've said, well, what are the nature of those risks and how do you assess them? So that's this center block here. Just let me see if I can annotate that. So that's this block that we've got sort of sitting here, where they've said, well, here's the links through to from those nature related impacts. There's then a set of questions about, well, what can the government what can the company actually do, or the organisation do, in terms of how to manage that? And then that flows into both the traditional reporting, so questions about our changes in profitability, changes in asset values, and those are reports that you'd expect to see flow through in standard accounting kind of reports anyway. And then higher level macroeconomic changes. Are we actually seeing a risk to the company at some, sort of higher level existential kind of level? So the sort of idea that would come forward there, if one imagined that one had a company that was, and I'm doing this off the top of my head, but let's imagine that you are the world's dominant producer of pears. And you happen to have all your orchards that grow pears in one part of the world. And it so happens that with climate change, if you look at the impact of a 0.5 degrees Celsius change in generalized temperatures, that it would cause all of those orchards to no longer be viable, to all die. Now, what they're saying here is, well, that's not a risk that we've ever sort of previously explicitly thought about. When we were doing an investment into an orchard, we've never previously explicitly said, well, what are the chances here that globalized climate change is going to cause this orchard in the next 10 or 15 years to become non-viable? But clearly, when you step back and think about it, that is actually a material risk, and it's therefore a risk that should be being thought about. So that's really what this diagram is saying, that the company is both dependent upon the environment in which it operates, but it also has impacts into that environment. So again, to take your Octedi example, they are not only dependent upon the water that's there, but they are impacting that water through the use, and the inappropriate use in that case, of that cyanide slurry. And I guess the point they're trying to make with this diagram, and it is actually quite a fundamental point, I think, in this whole sector, is that you end up with both direct financial impacts, but also indirect non-financial impacts, and hence their comment about the non-financial statements. So the disclosures that they're looking to talk about here are the ones that end up in these disclosure documents there. Just stop that mouse. Okay, so we've discussed there this overarching concept that sits under the TNFD of this LEAP approach: locate, evaluate, assess, prepare. And again, they make the point, and this is a snapshot from their website, that it is a voluntary guidance. Okay, they're saying we think that this is an appropriate kind of framework to use. Doesn't mean you have to use this. You can use some other approach. But nonetheless, it's a commonly accepted approach in risk management circles to do this kind of locate, evaluate, assess, prepare approach. It's not mandated, and the TNFD as such is not a mandated approach. It's a recommended framework. I note on the right there that it is the explicit intention of the TNFD members to be using or seeking these sorts of disclosures from clients, and that obviously then flows up into the disclosures that are made by the financial institution as a whole. So again, why does HSBC or Macquarie Bank, why do they care? Well, they care for a few reasons. Firstly, because if they lent or invested money into that BHP Octedi mine, they've probably lost their money. So they have a direct financial reason for caring, but also because their clients and investors themselves are asking those financial institutions to report where their risks are. So what's actually happening here is that you've got a series of individual investments, and those reports that those investments are providing flow up into the disclosures and reports that the financial institutions themselves have to make. And obviously, from the perspective of a major financial institution that has got thousands of investments that it's made, it would like those reports and those disclosures to be made in some sort of consistent way so that it can actually all be collated together. And this comes to the question of tools, data, and systems. And again, there is an enormous amount of work being done about the development of automated tools and software tools for doing that. And if we look back at their website, we see a lot of those tools, sitting in there. So the expectation here is that eventually you get to a point where the entire supply chain is producing disclosures under the same frameworks, and that those disclosures are just sort of flowing up the chain so that at any point in the chain, you can create a disclosure document of your own. Okay, so let's have a look at some particular examples from the framework here. So these again are recommended disclosures. They're not required disclosures, they're recommended disclosures. And they're suggesting reporting against essentially 4 separate areas. So disclosures around the governance of the organisation and how it's actually, how the management of that organisation is itself responsible for managing the risks that are identified. Disclosures around the strategy. So it's all very well to have the management, but the management has to actually have a strategy for how they're going to deal with these things. So describing what the nature of those strategies are, what the risks and impacts are. So again, we're back here to our standard risk management approach, identify the risk, identify the impact. So disclosing how these things are going to be managed, how the data is being collected. So note there in particular item C under that 3rd column. And again, I think this is a fairly, where's that? Okay, yes. So this one here, I think is actually probably one of the more important ones, which is around how nature-related impacts are being incorporated into the overall standardized risk management processes that are occurring within the organizations. And what we're really saying here is this is not intended to be some kind of standalone thing. It's intended to be something that works its way into standard risk management functions within the organization, and then also into standard reporting and standard financial reporting in particular. And again, I keep drawing back to these frameworks depend upon and feed into accounting standards and general management standards. You can expect to see, I think, a lot more detail coming through on these accounting standards side of things. So again, if those of you that sit in organisations where you've got a responsibility around reporting in some way, you'd be looking quite closely at how this stuff might be rolling through over the next few years. And then in terms of the disclosures, then coming down to some quite detailed disclosures around, well, how exactly are we measuring these things? What are actually the metrics at play? And obviously for large organisations that are in the public eye, you can assume that the metrics that you are stating that you are applying are going to be closely monitored by NGOs and environmental groups to actually see if you are adhering to them. So again, we can expect, I think, to see these disclosures being not only sought from NGOs, but then actively monitored by them. Okay, so again, let's take a look at some of the tools and platforms that are in there. So we've mentioned there, preparing metrics requires data and processing and analysis of data. To my reading, and as I said, I've not been involved with the piloting process. But to my reading, the pilot studies that have been done to this point, and there's been quite a number of them, are all identifying in different ways issues to do with the availability of data. So that's both the underlying data about, well, how do you actually assess this impact? So again, let's take our BHP Octedi example. If that were a new mine, you'd be looking for some data that said, well, if I spilled cyanide slurry here, what will actually the impact of that be up and down the watercourse? That sort of data is not automatically available, and that one is actually a relatively simple case because obviously it's simple enough in principle to measure where that would flow. When we start talking about more generalized sorts of environmental impacts, so let's say you're having an impact on land clearing, and that's going to affect nearby jungle and the orangutans that live there. You're getting into an area of, well, what data is actually available to enable me to assess these kind of things? And it's been clear from the pilot programs that they are all identifying significant gaps in data to actually get the frameworks working. Nonetheless, I've given some links there to some of the data materials that they're providing, and again, quite a lot of detail that one can get into there, and they do invite people who are interested to track how to obtain the data to sign up for that. Actually, I should mention just while I'm here something else on it, that they also under their sorry, here I'm there we go. Under the, it might be under getting involved. They do mention the consultation groups here. They have actually established consultation groups by region. You'll see that there is an ASEAN consultation group. I'm not sure how active it is, but they have mentioned here the name of the person who is running the TNFD consultation group in the ASEAN area. I haven't contacted them myself to ask what that consultation group is doing, but I pointed out to the audience of this section that may be a good place to start if you're wishing to look into this into the TNFD in more detail. Let me put back to this. Okay. One of the other direct impacts that comes forward here are impacts upon valuations. And oddly enough, this has been a topic of considerable discussion between myself and my colleagues and some of our clients. At least in the Australian context, one is often when dealing on when working on a deal of any sort, one often finds oneself needing to get an independent valuation done. So you could imagine in the simplest case that you're looking to get a mortgage on a house, and you as the bank seek that an independent valuation be done regarding the valuation of that house for the purpose of writing the loan. So the question then arises, well, what are the impacts on valuation of these sorts of things to do with nature risk or climate risk? And this is intended to be one of the things that comes out of the TNFD, is to provide the relevant disclosures and the relevant data to enable valuations to actually include some sensible estimates of the impacts that one might be facing. So you could imagine in the case of, let's say, a ski resort, if you were a banker and you were looking to make a loan against a ski resort, one of the things that would clearly impact valuation is your view around the likely global warming that might be going to be occurring, and the impact that might have upon the number of days in a year that ski resort could actually be operating as a ski resort. To this point in time, those sorts of questions have not formally been picked up and included into valuations, but that is very much explicitly the intention behind both the TNFD and the accounting frameworks, right? So this is now a topic that is under, certainly in Australia, is under active discussion by groups that do professional valuations, and I dare say that it is in other jurisdictions as well. So the way that the TNFD phrases this is to apply a double materiality test when doing your disclosures. So it's to ask two questions: how might what you're doing impact the nature? So in the case of that BHP Octedi, is there a risk that I'm going to spill this cyanide slurry and cause an environmental disaster downstream? Yes, there is. Is that a material risk to the business? Yes, it is. Therefore, it should be disclosed. The other side of that is how might nature impact you? So to take that example of the ski resort, clearly it is a potential impact on my business if there is a statistical decrease in the number of days where it's cold enough to ski. That is going to impact, that's a serious risk to my business. It's material because it will affect my financial performance. Therefore, I should disclose it. So the TNFD, suggests this in terms of how you report and what the impacts of that on valuations are. It's this double materiality test. What do you do to nature? What does nature do to you? Actually, I'll ask there if there's any questions on that, because that's actually a reasonably interesting point, I think. Any questions from the attendees there? Okay, moving right along. Okay, we've already seen this slide from before, but I make the note there that the TNFD does make the explicit point that not everything that is identified and assessed using that LEAP approach necessarily has to be disclosed. And that comes back to this materiality test, right? So one of the risks that I think we face here is people just producing, pages and pages and pages of senseless disclosures. That's really not the point of the exercise. The point of the exercise here very much is, well, what's actually material, and you disclose and report that. Okay, let's take a look at this one. So again, the figure that I would come to here is under this draft disclosure, if we're to do that. So it's there under this figure 4, TNFD and recommended disclosures. As I said, we've already seen that in the presentation, but that's where I got it from. Again, if you wanted to sort of hone in on well, what's the end point that sort of one gets to, it comes to this page here, and you'll see, to come back to Gundit's question before about the relationship between these things, that this is what they refer to as a TCFD, so the climate financial disclosures reporting in aligned recommendations. So again, I come back to the fact they're both based upon a similar underlying risk framework. So I point that one out on the page. Okay, we've mentioned the standards, we've mentioned the pilots, and again, those who are interested, I'd particularly commend you to take a look at the pilot reports that came out there. But look, key things that came out of it to do with the availability of the underlying data sets, and I think at least in the Australian case, that has certainly inspired the work that is being done by various government agencies to release and make more readily available a lot of underlying data. So I note there at the Australian government level, DECWA, which is the Department of Environment and Climate Change, in the most recent budget, they have actually allocated circa $100 million specifically to creating a data agency that is going to have responsibility for collating data, getting it into a consistent form, and then making it commonly available for the point of both this sort of reporting, but also more generally for doing risk management and other things. And again, I make the point that we are expecting to see the accounting standards increasingly moving into this space of mandating, or at least expecting, that certain sorts of standardized data is going to be made available. But yes, the key things that came out of the pilot studies around the availability of the data, the availability of suitable tools, particularly open source tools. One of the other things, if one looks back at that data catalog, so I'm going to just swap back to the page. You can see that they've got sitting under the tools. I actually can't see that on my screen. Just let me. So under that tools catalogue, let's say we were to just look at. Sorry, I'm having difficulty here. My mouse is stopping working. Choose one more or less at random. No, that's not a good one to choose at random. Let's go back to business footprint. Okay, so one of the things to note with these is that there's a range of tools, and some of them are sitting out of international groups. So, this one, for example, others are proprietary products that have been developed, and that's not to say they're not good, but it does raise questions about, well, where exactly is this data going? How am I using it? One of the points that a number of the participants in pilot studies made was that they actually need to be able to rely on tools that have got the data protection requirements built into them. So either it's a tool that they can download and run themselves in some kind of siloed manner so they can maintain control of their own confidential data, or it has to be a platform that is sitting in a known, trusted and approved jurisdiction. So this is the classic problem that you face with any manner of cloud-based tools. But nonetheless, it was a point that particularly came out in the pilots that a number of the tools that are uniquely available against some of these criteria actually have got issues around intellectual property and data protection and customer privacy and such. So just something to note in the event that you're looking at it. But look, there's a very wide range of tools that they've listed in there, and again, the interested person, I'd invite you to take a look at a number of those and just see the level of complexity that's with them. But there's a lot of work that is being done. Okay, so I think this is actually my last formal slide, but to come back to the question of, well, where to from here. And this is really, I think, my personal observations as to where I see this space is going and what it's going to impact. So first off, I come back to my opening point. I think this is going to be a very significant framework. I think it's going to impact a lot of things. I think it's going to alter investment flows in a very significant way. But here's some of the specific ways that we might see that. We could see this feeding into, within banks and financial institutions, the internal credit analysis and pricing tools. So that is to say, you might anticipate that an organisation that is making a set of disclosures to these standards, and that those disclosures show limited risks, that they could be getting offered discounted loans. Now, I know just today in the Australian Financial Review, which is one of our newspapers, there was an article in there regarding a farming company, a fairly significant agribusiness, that had negotiated with one of the major lenders a reduced interest rate on their loans, courtesy of having reported all this additional data into that credit decision-making matrix on the part of the bank. So, this is a real thing. It's already happening, and I think we expect to see it happen more and in a more consistent kind of framework. So I've said they're already common. Actually, I've probably overstated it there. I wouldn't say it's common, but it is certainly common enough that people are well aware of it. I think we can expect to see that this sort of data is going to be being collected, at least in part, through standard accounting processes. So we're going to see increasingly that the accounting sections of organisations, large corporates or financial institutions, become responsible for actually preparing standardised accounts and things. I think we can expect that to be coming. I think we can expect to see this sort of disclosure data being used as investment screening by funds. And I'm not talking specifically ESG funds that obviously attempt to do this, but I think we'd expect to see it as a standardized screen that appears across a lot of funds. It's particularly relevant, I think, for those that are involved in the mining and resources space, but I think you're going to see it, very broadly elsewhere. And the other one that perhaps is not attracted as much attention as it possibly should, but I think we're going to see it being used increasingly by policymakers and regulators. And I have a quote here from a senior executive at Rabobank, who said that in his view, it was totally clear that there would be nature-related stress testing from central banks around the world. Now, of course, again, we come back to, well, what's this actually about? Coming out of the global financial crisis back in 2007 through to 2009, 9-10, there was a lot of work done at the multilateral level around what sort of stress testing central banks and central financial regulators should be putting upon financial institutions. So should they be testing that they could cope with interest rates going up, or can they cope with there being a shutdown in the central transfer system, and if so, how long? So this was referred to as stress testing, and it's become a standard part of the toolkit for financial regulators to apply to financial institutions. The classic case of the too big to fail financial institution. So these days, what are known as systemically critical financial institutions are actually required to have a built-in breakup strategy, such that in the event that something goes terribly, terribly wrong, that a government can step in and, in an ordered and controlled way, order that organisation to be wound down or split up or otherwise dealt with. So one of the learnings out of the global financial crisis was to require those sort of plans. And the point that Bas Rutter here is making is that we're expecting to see this sort of data, and then the application of nature risk-related stress testing being something that actually becomes applied by central bankers and financial supervisors. Now, this is, of course, a new development. It's not, it's not traditionally been something that a financial services regulator would have seen as being in its mandate, to be doing a test around, well, what happens to your bank in the event that carbon prices go up, or in the event of unexpected drought. But that does seem to be the direction of travel here. So again, I think we're talking some quite profound changes in the way that the financial system as a whole is working. So this is one of the reasons why I started this lecture by saying, look, I think the TNFD is actually a very profound and impactful matter. I think it's something we're going to see having very large effects, both on the financial system, but then also upon the nature of investments that get made, the nature of how companies manage their risks in this space. I think it is actually going to be a very significant development. So with that said, I think that's my last actual prepared slide. And I am happy to take any further questions or discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Carl, for the comprehensive information about the TNFD. So we understand more how it was established, and also how many have started to use it. Yeah. Yeah, so now we have time for question or discussion. Anyone who have any question, you can just turn on your microphone and start discussion. in your opinion, the impact that included in this TNFD or something, do you think is the same or is more stringent than the one we use for like the environmental impact assessment or environmental and health impact assessment or something that,
Oh,
for example,
I think it's going to be much more impactful than either of those, but in a somewhat more hidden way. It comes to the nature of investment decisions that are being made, and you know, in the great bulk of cases, you're never going to see the direct smoking gun impact. It's not going to be that someone comes to you and says, I'm not going to invest into your mine specifically because of your TNFD disclosures. It will be, look, we've looked at all of your information, and that includes your TNFD disclosures, and on a risk-weighted basis, we've decided not to proceed with that investment. So again, it's a matter of judgment and opinion as to how big an impact that's going to have, but I have to say my view would be quite large over time. So yes, it's a very significant development, I think.
Okay. Yeah.
All right, Kunsunarat. Well, look, somewhat unusually for my lectures, it looks like I haven't said anything contentious enough to get a debate going, which is a good change for me.
Yes. So, okay. I think if there's no more question, I would like to conclude this webinar, and I think we will hear more about the TNFD, right? In the next, or more about the biodiversity, the markets for biodiversity and natural capital.
Yes. So next week's presentation is intended to be rather more specific than this one. So this presentation, we've been sitting up here in the stratosphere about, you know, high level frameworks. The next lecture is actually down at the other end, which is looking at some specific transactions, some specific deals, and unpicking them a bit to say, well, how was that deal put together? Where were the, you know, what was the balance? Let's say one of the ones we're going to look at is a farming operation who made the decision to take some of that farming operation out of production and to instead sell carbon credits and biodiversity credits from it. And so we're going to try and, you know, unpick a bit, well, how much money would they make from that? What are the decision metrics that went into that? So yeah, so next week's lecture gets a rather more hands-on, you know, deal-related, you know, case studies.
Yeah, so that will like give us the more clearer picture, because this is something very new to Thailand. Even though I think the Thai government also be part of the COP15 biodiversity, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's see how it's developed in Thailand, and yeah, we look forward to the presentation, your lecture next week. And before we close, I would like to remind all of you to evaluate our webinar by scanning this QR code, or by clicking on the link, the Google Form link, and you can tell us about our webinar, or you can even say what kind of topics that you would like to hear, or you would like to discuss, or even the questions if you have later. And then we will pass on to Carl. Yes, and so thank you again, Carl, for your talk, and looking forward to your lecture next week. Okay, thank you everyone. Yeah, bye bye. สวัสดีค่ะ